In August 1945, Tokyo lay in ruins. The proud capital of an empire that had once sought dominion over Asia was now reduced to ash, smoke, and silence. The night sky that had once shimmered with imperial ambitions now glowed red from the embers of defeat. Beneath the rubble, something unexpected was already taking root. Not hope, not yet, but an instinct for survival so fierce, so calculating, that it would one day redefine the meaning of modern finance. It is one of history's sharpest ironies that the nation most devastated by war would, within a single generation, become a model of economic efficiency and financial order. In the charred remains of Tokyo, a new kind of empire began to assemble itself, one built not on conquest or territory, but on balance sheets, banknotes, and the invisible machinery of capital. The fall and the vacuum. Japan's defeat was more than military, it was existential. The Meiji dream of modernity, which had once promised to make Japan rich and strong, had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The emperor's divine authority was humiliated. The military elite was disbanded. And Tokyo, once the radiant symbol of an ascendant Asia, became an occupied city under American supervision. Yet, amid humiliation, something astonishing occurred. In that vacuum of authority where the old gods of empire had fallen silent emerged a new creed: rationalism, discipline, and money. Not the chaotic capitalism of Wall Street, nor the reckless indulgence of pre-war zaibatsu monopolies, but a uniquely Japanese hybrid, a system where finance would become both servant and master of the state. When the American occupation authorities, led by General Douglas MacArthur, arrived, they believed they were bringing democracy to the East. What they actually did was unleash an economic experiment that would turn Tokyo into a crucible of financial modernity. The Americans sought to dismantle Japan's pre-war industrial conglomerates, the zaibatsu, which they viewed as engines of militarism. But in their attempt to decentralize power, they inadvertently laid the groundwork for a far more subtle and efficient network, the Kyoretsu, interlinked corporate families bound not by blood, but by credit. The Dodge Line, order from ruin. By 1949, Japan was a country on the brink of collapse. Inflation spiraled out of control, factories were idle, and millions were jobless. The yen was worthless, and Tokyo's financial institutions were paralyzed, neither capitalist nor socialist, merely suspended between disaster and indecision. Enter Joseph Dodge, an American banker whose name would become synonymous with Japan's fiscal resurrection. He arrived in Tokyo not as a conqueror but as a clerk of austerity. Armed with ledgers and a pitiless sense of order, his Dodge Line policy was brutal in its simplicity: balance the budget, stabilize the yen, eliminate government subsidies, and restore faith in money. Factories closed. Thousands lost their jobs. The press called it a financial scorched earth. But beneath the pain, a strange transformation began. The Japanese, disciplined, obedient, and collectively traumatized, did what they had always done best. They adapted. The austerity measures forced companies to become leaner, export-oriented, and efficiency-obsessed. Money became not a symbol of greed, but a symbol of recovery, a moral object. And in the heart of this new moral economy stood Tokyo, not yet glamorous, not yet rich, but quietly rearranging its ruins into the blueprint of a future financial capital. The American umbrella and the Cold War dividend. History, ever the ironist, gave Japan a second miracle: the Cold War. The same United States that had flattened Tokyo with bombs now protected it with dollars. With the Korean War erupting in 1950, Japan became the logistical supplier for the American military machine in Asia. Steel, textiles, machinery, the very industries that had once served the empire now served the Pax Americana. The influx of American orders was not merely economic, it was psychological. For the first time since the surrender, Japan had a purpose that was both profitable and respectable. Tokyo's ports, once silent, roared back to life. Its banks, once hollow, began to circulate real capital again. The special procurements from the U.S. military poured billions into the economy, reviving domestic production and restoring liquidity to financial institutions. This was not a free market miracle. It was a carefully managed symbiosis between state and industry, nurtured by geopolitical necessity. Under the American umbrella, Japan was allowed, even encouraged, to rebuild its financial system with a precision that bordered on obsession. The Ministry of Finance, the Bank of Japan, and emerging megabanks formed a trinity of control that would come to define Japan's financial identity. Bureaucratic capitalism in its purest form. Discipline as currency. It would be comforting to describe Japan's recovery as a story of resilience, but that would be too sentimental and historically dishonest. It was, rather, a story of submission and transformation. The Japanese people, exhausted by ideological wars, surrendered not to the West, but to the logic of productivity and credit. They replaced Bushido, the way of the warrior, with a new creed, the way of the worker. Factories became temples. Savings accounts became acts of patriotism. Every yen saved, every hour worked, was a step away from humiliation and a step toward modernity. In this strange new religion of money, Tokyo was both shrine and altar. The city rebuilt itself not in marble or myth, but in steel and accounting. Office towers rose where bomb shelters once stood. Concrete replaced wood, and the skyline became a declaration of purpose. The citizens of Tokyo no longer fought wars with weapons. They fought them with work hours, interest rates, and trade surpluses. The birth of financial modernity by the mid-1950s. The outlines of Tokyo's new financial architecture were clear. The government channeled credit to strategic industries through a tightly regulated banking system. Interest rates were set, not by market whim, but by bureaucratic design. The Tokyo Stock Exchange reopened in 1949, cautiously at first, but soon humming with renewed confidence. To the outside observer, this seemed paradoxical, a capitalist system run by bureaucrats, financed by banks that rarely failed, and populated by corporations that prized stability over profit. Yet it worked. Japan's GDP soared, and the nation's trade balance shifted from deficit to surplus. The financial discipline that had once seemed oppressive became the foundation of prosperity. Tokyo, still haunted by memories of firebombing and defeat, was reborn as a city of order, a living symbol of how finance could be moralized, systematized, and nationalized all at once. But beneath the triumph, there was an unspoken tension, a sense that this miraculous efficiency came at the cost of something vital. The new financial order prized control over creativity, consensus over risk. Japan's post-war miracle was built not on innovation, but on imitation, not on freedom, but on management. Still, in the 1950s, no one could see the irony. Tokyo had risen from its ashes, and the world was in awe. The silent revolution. While the Western world celebrated the consumer boom of the 1950s, Tokyo was waging a quieter revolution. Its financial system was evolving not as a mirror of Wall Street, but as a countermodel. Where the Americans trusted markets, the Japanese trusted ministries. Where the West worshipped individualism, Japan cultivated institutional unity. The Bank of Japan, once a passive instrument of state, became the beating heart of the new order. It orchestrated liquidity, directed investment, and managed the rhythm of growth with near-clinical precision. Every policy decision, every lending program, was executed like a military campaign, disciplined, coordinated, and national in scope. By the end of the decade, Japan had achieved what few believed possible: near full employment, stable prices, and a currency that no longer symbolized defeat. The yen had regained not just its value, but its dignity. And at the center of this transformation stood Tokyo, no longer the city of ashes, but the city of balance sheets. The irony of dependence. Yet, beneath the surface of success, an irony persisted. Japan's financial rebirth was made possible by the very forces that had once destroyed it. American aid, American markets, and American security formed the invisible scaffolding of Tokyo's prosperity. This dependency was not merely economic, it was ideological. The Japanese elite adopted Western economic principles, but filtered them through a distinctly national lens. Capitalism was accepted, but domesticated, made Japanese. The invisible hand of the market was guided, sometimes even chained, by the visible hand of the state. Thus, the miracle of Tokyo was not a spontaneous bloom of capitalism. It was a meticulously cultivated garden of controlled finance, pruned to perfection by bureaucrats who believed that growth could be engineered like an industrial product. The city assembled by 1960, Tokyo no longer resembled the haunted city of 1945. The skyline glittered with neon signs and glass towers. The air buzzed with ambition. Yet, for all its modernity, the city retained a quiet melancholy, as if aware that its rebirth had come at a moral cost. The people of Tokyo had learned to equate order with virtue, and growth with redemption. But as the city marched toward its destiny as a global financial hub, few asked the question that would haunt later generations: could a system built on control ever truly be free? In the end, the financial rebirth of Tokyo was not merely an economic event, it was a civilizational recalibration. From defeat rose a new faith in money as the supreme instrument of reconstruction, a belief so profound that it blurred the line between necessity and ideology. The irony is unmistakable. The city that once sought to rule Asia through force would, within decades, dominate it through finance, quietly, efficiently, and with a precision that no army could match. The whisper of the future as the 1950s drew to a close. Few could predict the heights Japan would reach or the dangers it would face. The seeds of the economic miracle were sown deep within these years of austerity and discipline. The Tokyo of post-war recovery was not yet the glittering metropolis of high finance, but its foundations were already solidifying in the vaults of its banks, in the ledgers of its ministries, and in the collective psychology of its people. The age of destruction had passed. The age of reconstruction was ending. And the age of financial modernity, born from ruin, irony, and precision, was about to begin. By the dawn of the 1950s, Tokyo was a city under reconstruction, not merely of stone and steel, but of soul and system. The skyline was still jagged, half-formed. The smell of wet concrete mingled with incense from makeshift shrines built on ruins. In offices lit by flickering bulbs and powered by rationed electricity, clerks bent over ledgers, rebuilding the nervous system of a nation. Japan's true rebirth was not taking place in its factories or its shipyards, but in the quiet, disciplined rhythm of its banks. It was here, in these bureaucratic sanctuaries of numbers and ink, that the new Japan was being written. The war had destroyed not just industries and infrastructure, it had obliterated faith. Faith in ideology, faith in empire, faith in destiny. And so, what emerged to fill the void was something far more modern and far more demanding. Faith in finance. Blueprints in the dust. The Americans had come to democratize the economy. What they ended up creating was something closer to a financial technocracy. In their attempt to dismantle the pre-war zaibutsu, those mighty family-owned industrial cartels that had fueled Japan's war machine, they set in motion a slow metamorphosis. Assets were redistributed, ownership diluted, and corporate structures broken apart. Yet, from this deliberate fragmentation emerged an even more intricate order. The keiretsu, networks of companies bound together by banks, not bloodlines. The irony was exquisite. In the name of destroying concentration of power, the occupation authorities had merely changed its form. Power did not vanish. It flowed, like capital itself, into new containers, more fluid, more discreet, and infinitely more effective. The great banks of Tokyo, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Mitsui, rose from the ashes as the quiet architects of a new empire. No longer arms manufacturers or imperial financiers, they became something purer and colder, instruments of national coordination. Each keiretsu bank stood at the center of a constellation of firms, directing credit, stabilizing balance sheets, and shaping entire industries through a system that blurred the line between competition and cooperation. The result was a financial ecosystem unlike any other in the world, disciplined, hierarchical, and insulated from the chaos of global markets. Tokyo was not building capitalism in the Western sense. It was constructing a financial bureaucracy, an economy governed by balance and restraint rather than risk and ambition. The Ministry of Finance, the new shogunate if the banks were the veins of post-war Japan. The Ministry of Finance MAF was its brain, and perhaps its conscience. Its bureaucrats, trained in the elite corridors of the University of Tokyo, viewed themselves not as servants of the public, but as custodians of national destiny. They were the new samurai, sworn not to a daimyo, but to the abstract ideal of fiscal order. In smoky conference rooms, MAF officials dictated the direction of credit, the scale of investment, and even the permissible rate of profit. Nothing moved in Tokyo's financial world without the ministry's blessing. They called it administrative guidance, a polite euphemism for command. To outsiders, it looked like socialism wearing a banker's suit. To the Japanese, it was something subtler, a covenant between discipline and destiny. The ministry's logic was almost moral. Unregulated markets had brought disaster before. Now only coordination could prevent chaos. And so, Tokyo became the stage of a quiet paradox, a capitalist economy governed by bureaucratic ethics. Each decision from interest rates to industrial quotas was imbued with the gravitas of moral necessity. Profit was tolerated, but stability was sacred. In a sense, the Ministry of Finance replaced the emperor as the moral center of national life. Its decrees carried a kind of secular divinity. Where once soldiers had marched under banners of conquest, now clerks and bankers toiled under the banner of efficiency. Japan had not abandoned hierarchy. It had merely reinvented it. The Bank of Japan, the keeper of equilibrium at the heart of this new order, pulsed the Bank of Japan Boge, not a mere lender of last resort, but a philosopher king of liquidity. Under its watchful eye, the post-war yen became more than currency. It became a social contract. Every policy decision, every adjustment in interest or reserve, was made with near theological precision, as if the very stability of the nation depended on the rhythm of its money supply. The Bank of Japan's mission was not to encourage risk, but to orchestrate harmony. Its governors spoke of monetary balance with the solemnity of priests discussing cosmic order. The goal was simple, to ensure that money, once scarce and volatile, would become the most stable force in Japanese life, and it worked. Inflation, once a raging inferno, was tamed. Credit began to flow, cautiously but steadily, into industries chosen not by markets but by ministries. The yen, once a symbol of defeat, became an emblem of control. Yet beneath this serenity lay an irony so deep it almost felt deliberate. The more Japan's economy grew, the less free it became. Every factory, every corporation, every financial transaction was entangled in a web of relationships, a web spun not by speculators, but by bureaucrats. Tokyo had turned finance into a science of obedience. The cult of saving. The new Japan needed capital, and in a nation still haunted by scarcity, it found that capital not abroad, but at home. The post-war government launched an almost moral crusade to encourage saving. Posters adorned the streets of Tokyo, urging citizens to deposit their money for the good of the nation. Housewives saved coins in government-issued tins. Children were taught that thrift was patriotic. And so, from the ashes of consumer deprivation, Japan built one of the highest national savings rates in the world. Those savings, channeled through banks and postal accounts, became the lifeblood of industrial expansion. Every yen saved by a housewife in Shinjuku or a clerk in Ginza eventually found its way into the coffers of the great corporations. Toyota, Toshiba, Nippon Steel, all marching toward the same collective goal: growth. The paradox was elegant, almost poetic. A nation once addicted to conquest had become addicted to saving. Greed was not encouraged. It was sublimated into duty. Consumption was restrained, not by scarcity, but by conscience. Tokyo, the new financial capital, was built not on speculation but on sacrifice. The rebirth of the Tokyo Stock Exchange. When the Tokyo Stock Exchange reopened in 1949, it did so under a cloud of skepticism. Too many Japanese, the idea of investing in equities still reeked of corruption and pre-war excess. Yet slowly, methodically, the government rehabilitated the market's image. Regulation was tight, speculation was discouraged, transparency became an article of faith. By the mid-1950s, the exchange was humming again, not as a playground for gamblers, but as a controlled theater of national confidence. Stocks rose in step with productivity, and dividends reflected not greed, but collective prosperity. Still, Tokyo's markets were not truly free. The great keiretsu companies held cross-shareholdings in one another, creating a dense network of mutual ownership that insulated them from foreign investors and hostile takeovers. The result was a market without chaos, a capitalism without capitalists. This was Japan's genius and its curse: stability so perfect that it became a form of paralysis. The industrial symphony each morning. As the sun rose over the Sumida River, Tokyo stirred to the rhythm of its new economy. Bankers in dark suits hurried through the Marunouchi district, their briefcases heavy with contracts and confidence. Bureaucrats in the Ministry of Finance drafted policy papers that would shape the fate of entire industries. On factory floors across the country, machines whirred and sparks flew, not chaotically, but in unison. Japan's financial system was not a market. It was a symphony. Each player knew his part, each note was predetermined, and the conductor, the state, allowed no improvisation. The result was breathtaking. Between 1955 and 1973, Japan's economy grew at an average of nearly 10% per year. Western economists watched in disbelief. How could an economy so tightly controlled, so seemingly rigid, outperform the freewheeling capitalism of America and Europe? The answer lay in the harmony of its institutions, a harmony that masked the anxiety beneath. For in that perfection, there was fragility. Systems built on coordination, after all, depend on the infallibility of their conductors, and history rarely allows perfection to last. The philosophy of control in the West, capitalism, was often justified as freedom. In Japan, it became something else: responsibility. Every major financial institution, from the Bank of Japan to the smallest savings cooperative, operated under a shared belief that chaos was the enemy, that volatility was immoral. Finance, once the realm of speculation, had been moralized into an act of national service. Bankers spoke of social purpose with straight faces. Economists discussed guided capitalism as if it were an ethical system. The boundaries between morality and management blurred, and the Japanese people, disciplined by hardship, accepted it without question. Tokyo's new financial architecture was not built on trust in the market, but on trust in institutions, trust that the guardians of stability would never falter. But even in the calmest system, entropy gathers. Beneath the order, new tensions were forming, between innovation and control, between national goals and private ambition. These tensions would one day tear the system apart. For now, however, in the early 1960s, Tokyo stood serene and proud, a monument to the idea that finance could be engineered, managed, and moralized all at once. The city as machine walked through Tokyo in those years, and you could feel the hum, not of chaos, but of precision. Trains ran to the minute. Money moved to the decimal. Bureaucrats spoke in formulas. Citizens saved in rhythms. It was as though the entire metropolis had been tuned to the frequency of efficiency. Even architecture reflected the ethos. Banks resembled fortresses, unadorned, solemn, symmetrical. Government buildings exuded authority without ornament. The new Tokyo was a city designed to be trusted, not loved, but obeyed. And yet, for all its order, there lingered a sense of melancholy. The Tokyo of the 1950s and 60s was a city haunted by its own success. Beneath the fluorescent lights and polished marble, one could still hear the echo of air raid sirens, the memory of what discipline had once led to. It was as if Japan had rebuilt not just its economy, but its conscience, purged, purified, and sealed inside the vaults of its financial institutions. The stillness before the surge. By the time the Olympic flame was lit in Tokyo in 1964, the transformation was complete. The world saw a nation reborn, a city gleaming with prosperity and precision. To the outside observer, it was a miracle, a testament to resilience, discipline, and faith in order. But those who looked closer saw something more complicated, a system that had traded chaos for control, ambition for coordination, freedom for harmony. Tokyo's financial architecture was perfect to perfect. Beneath the glass towers and tidy balance sheets, the city was already dreaming of more, of global expansion, of technological supremacy, of financial conquest. The machinery of order, once built for survival, was beginning to crave power. The seeds of Tokyo's future, its triumphs and its tragedies, had already been sown. The architecture stood firm. But in every perfect system, history waits quietly, patiently for the first crack to appear. Tokyo, by the dawn of the 1960s, had begun to hum with the rhythm of an empire, reborn not an empire of territory, but of production, precision, and paradox. The city's skyline, once fractured by defeat, was now pierced by cranes instead of cannon smoke. Steel and ambition fused into the skeleton of a new financial organism. If destruction had been the first currency of post-war Japan, construction was its compound interest. The miracle, as it was later called, did not arrive like revelation, it was engineered. Japan's financial modernity was a calculated act of alchemy, turning scarcity into strength, weakness into weaponry, and capital into control. The Western world watched, mystified, as a country that had lost everything created an economy that seemed to transcend logic. But beneath the glittering surface of growth, Tokyo's financial ascent was not born of pure capitalism. It was something far more intricate, a disciplined symphony of bureaucracy, corporate loyalty, and silent coercion. At the heart of this transformation pulsed the strange organism known as keiretsu, industrial conglomerates that replaced the pre-war zaibatsu. These were not mere corporations. They were networks, binding banks, manufacturers, and trading companies into self-sustaining ecosystems. Each keiretsu functioned as both fortress and bloodstream, circulating credit, materials, and influence in a closed loop that defied Western market logic. In New York or London, capital flowed like a river, directed by profit. In Tokyo, it flowed like a current within a coral, restructured, reciprocal, and almost living. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry MITI was the unseen composer of this orchestra. Its bureaucrats, armed not with ideology but with spreadsheets and quiet authority, dictated the tempo of national ambition. They decided who would rise, who would merge, who would disappear. Their language was not poetry but policy, yet within those dry memoranda lay the architecture of Japan's new empire. They were the high priests of productivity, channeling limited resources into targeted sectors: steel, shipbuilding, electronics, automobiles. Each directive carried the unspoken weight of national salvation. And then, there was the Bank of Japan, the silent metronome beneath it all. Its policies of low interest and controlled credit gave the keiretsu their oxygen. It was not a free market, it was a managed miracle. A collaboration between state and enterprise that blurred the line between public and private, profit and purpose. The irony, perhaps, was that in rejecting the pure capitalism of their conquerors, Japan had built the most efficient capitalist machine the world had ever seen. Factories bloomed where ashes once lay. The sound of hammers and turbines became Tokyo's new anthem. The country's exports, radios, cameras, textiles began to flow outward, first tentatively, then with unstoppable force. The world called it an economic miracle, but miracles do not happen by chance. They are crafted, sustained, and often demanded at unbearable human cost. Behind the gleaming windows of Marunouchi's financial district, there were workers sleeping on factory floors, engineers working without pause, and a society whose identity became inseparable from labor itself. The Japanese salaryman, the tireless anonymous engine of growth, was the new soldier in a bloodless war. Tokyo's financial ascension was built on a strange moral compact. The nation would work without rest, and in return, it would never again know humiliation. Economic growth became both redemption and religion. Every export shipped from Yokohama or Kobe was an unspoken declaration. Japan is alive. Japan is powerful. Japan has mastered the language of modernity and rewritten it. Foreign economists came to study this phenomenon, bringing with them models and metrics that failed to explain it. The Western assumption was that markets were driven by individual ambition. Japan proved that collective discipline could yield equal, if not greater, returns. The balance sheet became a battlefield, and Tokyo was winning without firing a shot. Yet, beneath the precision of this financial choreography, there was tension and unease that could not be quantified. The very structure that fueled Japan's growth also trapped it. The keiretsu, for all their efficiency, created a system resistant to disruption. Credit was recycled among allies, innovation flowed only within sanctioned channels, and risk was quietly exiled. Stability became the enemy of reinvention. Still, in those early decades, such concerns seemed trivial compared to the dazzling scale of success. The yen strengthened. Foreign reserves swelled. Tokyo, once a shattered memory, now competed with New York and London as the beating heart of global finance. Western bankers, who had once seen Japan as a supplicant, now bowed politely to its precision. The 1964 Tokyo Olympics crystallized this transformation. The world watched as the city unveiled its new self. Sleek, efficient, modern. Bullet trains replaced ox carts. Neon replaced ruins. Yet the Olympics were more than spectacle. They were a financial coming-of-age. Infrastructure projects, fueled by state-directed capital, merged national pride with macroeconomic strategy. For the first time, the global audience saw not a defeated nation, but a financial civilization. But Tokyo's triumph carried a shadow. The relentless pace of expansion demanded conformity, obedience, and a quiet erasure of individuality. The miracle was efficient because it was centralized. It was enduring because it was unquestioned. Economic modernity had become a kind of moral imperative, and dissent, whether political or personal, was treated as inefficiency. The very order that birthed prosperity also began to calcify it. And yet, through this disciplined rigidity, Japan accomplished something profound. It redefined what modern finance could mean. Where the West equated progress with competition, Japan equated it with harmony. Where others sought profit, Japan sought balance. In doing so, it exposed a deeper truth about capitalism itself, that its success depends not on freedom alone, but on faith, structure, and shared illusion. By the late 1960s, Tokyo had become more than a city. It was a metaphor for the future, a future built not on conquest, but on coordination, a future where money did not merely circulate but obeyed. And in that obedience there was both beauty and danger, because in every miracle lies the seed of its undoing. The very system that had saved Japan, the intricate web of banks, industries, and ministries, would one day suffocate it. But in this moment, in the crescendo of growth and gleaming glass towers, such a thought was heresy. The empire of money had risen from the ashes, immaculate and invincible. And Tokyo, radiant and relentless, stood at its center, proof that even defeat, when disciplined, could be transformed into destiny. By the 1970s, Tokyo had ceased to be merely a city. It had become a pulse, an unrelenting rhythm of fluorescent light, order, and aspiration. The skyline was no longer a monument to survival. It was an altar to velocity. Every window reflected ambition. Every ledger whispered faith. Japan's economic miracle was no longer a policy goal, it was a national identity. To grow was to exist. To slow down was to die. Factories no longer smoked. They glowed. Neon replaced ash, and the streets of Shinjuku and Ginza shimmered with the silent electricity of efficiency. Tokyo's towers rose like disciplined prayers, each built on the premise that the future was measurable, manageable, and above all, inevitable. The city had become a clockwork organism. People moved in synchronized waves. Trains arrived to the second, and money flowed with the quiet authority of fate. Yet beneath that mechanical grace was a collective anxiety so subtle it felt sacred. The very success that had redeemed Japan now demanded worship. Growth became not a means to an end, but an end in itself, a kind of national liturgy performed daily in boardrooms and trading floors. The postwar vow never again had evolved into something new, never enough. The Bank of Japan's policies, still guided by caution and consensus, continued to feed the machine. Interest rates remained low. Credit flowed like engineered rain. The Ministry of Finance and MITI fine-tuned the levers of expansion with surgical precision, ensuring that every yen circulated within the body politic, nourishing industry and infrastructure. Japan by then was exporting not just goods but perfection. Its cars, its cameras, its transistors were not merely commodities but ambassadors of a philosophy. Each product carried the quiet assertion that discipline could outperform ideology, that design could replace domination. The Western world watched in disbelief as the nation it had once bombed now threatened to outproduce and outthink it. Economists coined phrases Japan Inc., the Japanese model, as if trying to capture an alchemical secret in bureaucratic language. Tokyo's financial system, so unlike Wall Street's brash capitalism, seemed immune to crisis. It was methodical, modest, and mercilessly efficient. Where others speculated, Japan planned. Where others fragmented, Japan coordinated. But such harmony had a price. In the private corners of company apartments and late-night trains, exhaustion lingered like a ghost. The salaryman, once the emblem of national recovery, had become a symbol of quiet martyrdom. He belonged not to himself but to the corporation, a microcosm of the nation. State promotions replaced prayer. Bonuses replaced belief. To fail in one's duty was not a professional lapse but a moral sin. Tokyo's financial rise had given birth to a new kind of human being, the one who measured his worth not in freedom but in efficiency. Leisure became an indulgence. Emotion became inefficiency. Children were taught that sacrifice was patriotic, that precision was purity. It was a society that mistook stillness for stagnation. Meanwhile, the world changed. The oil crises of the 1970s struck like tremors beneath Japan's carefully engineered surface. For a nation with almost no natural resources, dependence on foreign energy threatened to unravel the illusion of invincibility. Yet Japan adapted with characteristic grace. The state redirected its machinery toward high technology and knowledge-based industries. Where oil faltered, innovation flourished. The miracle evolved, not ended. But something deeper had begun to shift, something invisible, psychological. The generation that had rebuilt from ashes now found itself trapped within its own architecture of success. Their children inherited not despair but expectation. The miracle that once inspired awe now imposed obligation. It was no longer about proving Japan's worth to the world, it was about proving it to itself, every day, in every metric. The city's very geography mirrored this tension. Beneath the manicured precision of Marunouchi's glass towers lay the narrow alleyways of Shitamachi, where the ghosts of an older Japan still lingered. The contrast was not just physical but philosophical. The old Tokyo whispered of impermanence, of human frailty. The new Tokyo demanded immortality through productivity. The two coexisted, but uneasily, like past and future sharing the same fragile breath. Financial modernity had redefined everything from the shape of ambition to the structure of emotion. Even art and architecture reflected this paradox. Concrete replaced wood, symmetry replaced spontaneity. The aesthetics of finance, clean, efficient, restrained, permeated the cultural bloodstream. Beauty became industrial, perfection mechanical. The city itself was a statement of order against the chaos of history. And yet, deep within the machine, a subtle fatigue was growing. The system's perfection left no room for failure, no oxygen for doubt. In a society that had conquered poverty, fear returned in a new form, the fear of losing momentum. Every economic plateau felt like decline, every slowdown like shame. The numbers had to rise not because the people demanded it, but because the nation's sense of self required it. By the late 1970s, Tokyo had achieved what no one thought possible, a fusion of ancient collectivism and modern capitalism. It was a financial civilization built on restraint, cooperation, and unspoken hierarchy. But beneath its immaculate order lay a truth too dangerous to articulate. Japan's growth had ceased to be economic. It had become existential. When growth becomes identity, the cycle can never stop. The factories must hum, the yen must strengthen, the graphs must climb, because to slow is to question, and to question is to betray the covenant of progress. The financial city, that radiant symbol of modernity, began to resemble something older, a shrine to invisible gods, demanding endless offerings. And so, Tokyo marched on, disciplined, dazzling, devout. Its subways pulsed with precision, its towers gleamed like commandments, its citizens moved as if choreographed by history itself. From the outside, it was perfection incarnate. From within, it was an empire built on pressure, sublime, silent, and absolute. The rest of the world called it a miracle. But miracles, as history so often reminds us, are never free. By the dawn of the 1980s, Tokyo had ascended into myth. The city no longer merely participated in global finance, it defined its tempo. Every skyscraper, every subway line, every neon reflection in the Sumida River seemed to whisper the same incantation. Japan has mastered modernity. The miracle had become the measure of all things. But perfection, when institutionalized, ceases to be aspiration, it becomes obligation. An obligation, in the language of finance, is another word for debt. The 1980s began with a quiet delirium. The world, dazzled by Japan's precision, began to speak of the Japanese century. Analysts wrote, with reverence, of lifetime employment, of corporate harmony, of an economic model immune to Western volatility. It was, they said, the triumph of discipline over chaos, of long-term vision over speculative greed. And yet, even as Tokyo's skyline rose higher, the invisible scaffolding beneath it began to tremble. The roots of the coming crisis lay within the very structure that had sustained Japan's miracle. The Bank of Japan, ever cautious, had kept interest rates low to encourage investment and maintain stability. But stability, in a nation addicted to growth, became a kind of narcotic. Easy credit flooded the economy. The keiretsu, still the backbone of industrial coordination, began to expand their portfolios beyond production into speculation. Factories gave way to financial instruments. Innovation yielded to valuation. Land became the new currency of faith. Tokyo's real estate, long a symbol of national pride, turned into an obsession. Plots of land were bought and sold, not for what they were, but for what they could be, an abstraction of wealth so potent it bordered on theology. A single square meter in the Ginza district was rumored to be worth more than all the land in California. Economists gasped, but few objected. Who could argue with perfection? The logic of the bubble was as elegant as it was fatal. Rising land prices fueled borrowing, which fueled spending, which in turn raised land prices further. The circle was complete, self-reinforcing and intoxicating. Banks, encouraged by state policy and blinded by confidence, lent freely. Corporations borrowed not to innovate but to speculate. The stock market soared. Paper wealth replaced tangible production. Japan, once the embodiment of post-war restraint, was now a casino dressed in a scholar's robes. Yet even in the midst of the frenzy, there was no open hysteria, no champagne-soaked bravado like on Wall Street, no visible excess. Japan's bubble wore the mask of modesty. The speculation was quiet, methodical, and bureaucratically justified. The nation convinced itself that what it was doing was not gambling, but planning. Tokyo's bankers spoke of asset-based finance, of strategic investment, of rational optimism. Beneath the euphemisms lay the same ancient temptation that had undone empires, the belief that growth could be permanent. It is perhaps the cruelest irony of all that a society built on discipline should fall to excess, and that its excess should be disguised as discipline. The same forces that had once saved Japan, the intricate ties between banks and corporations, the deference to bureaucracy, the faith in harmony, now ensured that no one dared to question the madness. When everyone is responsible, no one is accountable. And so, Tokyo's skyline rose higher still, even as its foundations softened. Office towers multiplied like symbols of divine favor. Land values soared by hundreds of percent. Art, golf club memberships, even antique kimonos became speculative assets. Newspapers reported record profits. The yen grew strong. The world marveled. Japan's corporations were buying iconic Western landmarks, the Rockefeller Center, movie studios, art collections, as if reclaiming history through acquisition. The West called it economic imperialism. Japan called it inevitability. But perfection, by definition, cannot evolve, it can only shatter. By the late 1980s, the Bank of Japan faced an impossible choice: tighten credit and risk the illusion, or let the illusion consume itself. It chose the former too late. The moment interest rates rose, the fragile scaffolding collapsed, land prices fell, stock values plummeted, and with them, the collective faith that had sustained the nation's economic identity. Overnight, paper wealth turned to dust. Fortune turned to shame. The 1990s dawned not with triumph, but with silence. The bubble's implosion was more than financial, it was existential. For decades, Japan had equated prosperity with virtue, stability with identity. Now both had vanished. The lost decade that followed was not simply an economic slowdown, it was a reckoning. The temples of modern finance, banks, ministries, corporations stood intact, but their sanctity had been broken. The irony was profound. Japan had mastered financial modernity so completely that it had revealed its flaw. In chasing control, it had built fragility. In worshipping growth, it had forgotten purpose. The financial city that had once symbolized rebirth now became a museum of restraint, a place where ambition was tempered by the memory of its own excess. Yet even in collapse, Tokyo did not lose its dignity. There were no riots, no visible despair. The same stoic discipline that had built the miracle now absorbed its undoing. Companies restructured quietly. Families endured silently. The neon lights still glowed, but now they seemed to flicker with a different tone, not the brilliance of certainty, but the melancholy of wisdom. And perhaps that, too, was part of Japan's gift to financial history. In its rise, it demonstrated the power of order. In its fall, the danger of perfection. Tokyo had been both cathedral and cautionary tale, a city that proved finance could be an instrument of collective identity, but also a mirror, reflecting humanity's oldest delusion, that progress can be permanent, that numbers can replace meaning, that wealth can outpace time. As the century turned, the world looked upon Tokyo not with pity, but with a strange respect. For though the miracle had ended, its echo remained, a haunting rhythm of discipline and desire that continued to shape global finance. In every modern city that sought to rise as a financial capital, there was a trace of Tokyo's shadow, the dream of control, the fear of collapse, the hope that prosperity might one day be tamed. The lights along the Sumida still shimmer at night, the bullet trains still glide with impossible precision, and somewhere within that mechanical perfection there lingers a truth too human to ignore. That every miracle, financial or otherwise, carries within it the seed of its own undoing, because perfection, once attained, must either be transcended or fall.